If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism. This episode is going to be a little, maybe a lot, different from our usual dive into Catholic doctrine or history or Bible or apologetics. But with all of the current chaos in our culture, the endless debates over gender roles and identity crises and societal breakdowns, I think it's worth reaching back for some ideas, some models, even some ideals from earlier eras of Catholic history. So, over the next 2 episodes, starting with this one on masculine chivalry and following up in the next one with feminine genius, I'm going to unpack these old Catholic concepts. Now look, I'm not saying that they should apply rigidly to everyone or that we can all achieve them perfectly in our messy world. But as our young men and women drown in this, whatever it is, this post-Christian, post-modern, post-rational swamp of transgender debates and transhuman fantasies and transmoral relativism, with flat screens sucking away their souls and antidepressants numbing their pain and alternative realities that have been spun from video games and social media madness, let me suggest that it might not hurt. In fact, it certainly couldn't make anything worse if our young men and women considered some timeless Catholic visions of what it means to be a man or a woman. And look, I'm not naive. I also realize that this episode might cost me some listeners, because there are some folks, some devout Catholics, some that I know who are wonderful people, who think that in times like the ones that we live in, that principles like chivalry are exactly the wrong direction for our young men to go. Some will say that we need to raise our boys to be more peaceful, more conciliatory, more inclusive, less toxically masculine. But I hope that over the next half hour or so, you'll see that chivalry is consistent with the fruits of the Spirit that Paul lists in Galatians 5. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Instead of toxic masculinity, I think that chivalry represents virtuous and valiant masculinity. Chivalry calls boys to grow up into healthy, constructive, and courteous men who also can be counted on in a fight. And so, if I lose some listeners over this, so be it. But if I do, I don't think it will be women who tune me out. I think that most Christian women today would love to see boys grow into chivalrous men. I think that most Christian women don't think that we suffer from too much chivalry today, but too little. And I think that most of them would love their sons to grow up to become those kinds of men. So, to kick this off, imagine a knight in gleaming armor, kneeling not before a king or on a battlefield, but in a quiet chapel. His sword laid at the foot of a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And as he kneels there, he's whispering a vow to defend the orphan, to honor the lady, and to lay down his own life like Christ did on the cross. I mean, that image hits me every time I think about it, because it's not just some fairy tale from a dusty old book. It's the heart of what medieval Catholic chivalry was all about. a bold, unapologetic fusion of raw, manly courage and deep Christian humility. And yeah, I know we're talking about an era of crusades and castles where knights rode off to war with banners flying, but strip away the Hollywood gloss, and what you're left with is a vision that was profoundly Catholic, a way of life that tried to marry the steel of a warrior with the soul of a saint. But before we dive any deeper, let's make sure that we're on the same page about what the word chivalry even means. Because it's not a word that we throw around much these days, and it's often misunderstood as just being polite or opening doors for old ladies. Our English word chivalry comes from the old French word chevalerie, which literally means knighthood, or the qualities of a knight on horseback. It was derived from chevalier, which means a warrior on horseback, and that was derived from the old Latin word caballarius, or horseman. It began to emerge as a concept in the Carolingian Empire around the 8th to 9th centuries, but it really took shape as a formal code in the 11th and 12th centuries, during the height of feudalism and the Crusades. At its core, chivalry was a moral, social, and military system that emphasized virtues like bravery and loyalty and honor and generosity and protection of the weak, especially of women, children, and the church. In the heart of the Middle Ages, it was the church's way of taming the wild warrior class, turning potential thugs into guardians of Christendom. Now, I have to admit, my personality has always been attracted to the idea of knights in armor and chivalry and all of that. When I was a kid, I read Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia and other kinds of stories. But my images of chivalry came from books like that, or from movies or fantasies of knights errant rescuing damsels. It was when I began investigating Catholicism and Catholic history seriously that I realized that chivalry wasn't just a code for, swinging swords. It was a spiritual discipline rooted in the Church's teaching. It emerged in the Middle Ages, like I said, around the 11th to 13th centuries, when Europe was this mess of feudal lords and Viking raids and Muslim incursions into Christian lands. And the Catholic Church looked around and saw these rough warriors, guys who lived by the blade, and said, okay, hold up. Let's channel all of that energy for good. So chivalry became this ideal. Take the martial skills, right? Martial is like warlike skills. Take the martial skills, their bravery in battle, and then infuse them with Christian virtues like justice and mercy and piety. C.S. Lewis was this huge influence on my childhood through his Chronicles of Narnia. And then later, when I was in college, I became a Christian partly through reading his apologetics books like Mere Christianity and his fiction novels like the Space Trilogy. Now, yes, I'm fully aware Lewis was an Anglican, but by trade, he was a medieval scholar, and the Middle Ages were Catholic. So when he wrote about the Middle Ages, he was writing about Catholicism. And Lewis wrote this fascinating short essay called The Necessity of Chivalry. In it, he argues that chivalry wasn't really a compromise between the warrior and the gentleman, but instead it was what he calls a double demand. On the one hand, the knight must be infinitely fierce in battle, and yet on the other hand, infinitely meek when he's in the hall with the ladies and the court and other people. Lewis said that a chivalrous knight must be a, quote, man of blood and iron, who's also, quote, demure, almost maiden-like among the ladies. Lewis said that chivalry like this is an art that we must cultivate in our society. Otherwise, he said, society splits into brutal wolves who prey on defenseless sheep. As he put it, quote, the man who combines both characters, the knight, is not a work of nature, but of art, of that art which has human beings instead of canvas or marble, for its medium. And he warned that chivalry offers the only possible escape from a world divided between wolves who do not understand and sheep who cannot defend, the very things which make life desirable. And I think that in his essay, Lewis captures some element of the Catholic vision. Chivalry is sanctified strength. It imitates Christ's whip in the temple and cross on Calvary. It's a both and of ferocity and humility that's essential for defending the kingdom and Christendom. Now, one of the key texts from the Middle Ages that spells all of this out is Ramon Lull's Book of the Order of Chivalry, written in the late 13th century. Lull was a fascinating guy. He was a Catalan knight who had a conversion experience. He became a Franciscan tertiary, and he wrote this manual like a dialogue between a hermit and a squire. And in it, he lays it out plainly. He says that chivalry isn't about glory or loot. It's a divine calling. But Lull warns against empty show. He says, "Do not seek nobility of courage in the mouth, for it does not always tell the truth. And do not seek it in resplendent vestments, for beneath them may hide a vile heart." Ouch, that's a gut check. You see, true chivalry for Lull means integrity. A knight's word was his bond, his strength served the weak, and his life imitated Christ's sacrifice. And it wasn't just talk. The church formalized all of this through ceremonies, like the dubbing of a knight, where he'd spend the night in vigil before the altar, and then receive his sword blessed by a priest. The ideal was clear: defend the faith, protect widows and orphans, honor women as reflections of Mary. But let's be real. I'm not naive about history. Knights often fell short. Maybe most of the time they fell short. There were corrupt knights who pillaged villages or chased personal power. Chivalry was an aspiration, an ideal, a principle, not a universal reality. And yet, that vision, that ideal, that principle was compelling because it was uniquely Christian. It didn't pit strength against spirituality. It united strength and spirituality. For example, take St. Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian abbot who championed the Knights Templar in the 12th century. In his treatise, In Praise of the New Knighthood, he contrasts worldly knights who fight for vanity and gold with these new monastic warriors. St. Bernard wrote, "He is truly a fearless knight and secure on every side, for his soul is protected by the armor of faith, just as his body is protected by armor of steel. He is thus doubly armed and need fear neither demons nor men." St. Bernard saw the Templars as a new knighthood that fought not just physical battles, but spiritual ones, echoing St. Paul's armor of God language in Ephesians. And he got poetic about martyrdom. St. Bernard wrote, "In every peril repeat, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. How gloriously victors return from battle. How blessedly martyrs die in battle." You see, for St. Bernard, chivalry was holy war, internal and external, where courage met sanctity. And this ties right into St. Thomas Aquinas, the great Dominican theologian, who in his Summa Theologica unpacks fortitude as a cardinal virtue. Fortitude, for Aquinas, is the strength to endure dangers for a just cause, especially in defense of the good. Aquinas quotes Aristotle, but he baptizes Aristotle. He says, "No man fears to do what he is confident of having learned to do well." But Aquinas elevates it. For him, fortitude isn't brute force. It's moderated by prudence, and it's aimed at charity. In question 123, he says that fortitude perfects us against fear of death, making it essential for knights who faced constant peril. And Aquinas roots it in God. He says, God himself is the rule and mode of virtue. So, a chivalric knight wasn't just tough, he was virtuous. His bravery was a gift from the Holy Spirit. It aligned with the Church's teaching on the cardinal virtues and spiritual gifts like fortitude. See, at its core, chivalry modeled the imitation of Christ. Jesus wasn't some passive figure. He drove out the money changers with a whip. He endured the cross with unspeakable resolve. Chivalry echoed that. It was a self-gift where a knight poured out his life for others. Think of the vows to vow poverty and chastity and obedience for orders like the Templars. It was that kenosis, that self-emptying that St. Paul talks about in Philippians. And with all of this talk of masculinity, what about honoring femininity? In the chivalric ideal, that comes straight from Marian devotion. Mary, the Theotokos, the Mother of God, was the ultimate lady, pure, humble, exalted. And chivalric knights venerated her as their queen. They saw in every woman a reflection of the Blessed Virgin Mary's dignity. This wasn't about macho dominance over women. It was protective honor, imitating St. Joseph's role as a guardian. Hey, I just want to take a moment to say that your support keeps this thing going. Look, this show is 100% listener supported. We don't run advertisements. And so if it's helped answer your questions or deepen your faith or moved you along the road to Rome, like it has for so many people that I hear from, would you click the PayPal donate button in the show notes or on the website at consideringcatholicism.com. Together, you and I, we can educate, equip, and excite more people about historic Catholic Christianity. And speaking of guardians, let's not forget the saints who embodied all of these chivalric virtues in profound ways. Take St. George, the legendary dragon slayer from the 3rd century, whose story became a medieval emblem of knightly heroism. He was a Roman soldier and Christian martyr. He faced persecution under the Emperor Diocletian, but his tale of battling the dragon symbolizes conquering evil through faith and courage, protecting the innocent princess, a stand-in for the Church of the soul. St. George is the patron saint of knights, soldiers, and England, reminding us that true chivalry fights spiritual battles first. And then there's St. Michael the Archangel, not a human saint, but the ultimate warrior of heaven, leading the angelic hosts against Satan in Revelation. As a patron of soldiers and the police, he exemplifies the martial defense of good against evil, pure fortitude without a flaw. And last, but certainly not least, don't overlook Saint Joseph himself, often called a model of chivalry for his quiet strength in protecting Mary and Jesus, fleeing to Egypt, providing as a carpenter, surrendering himself with nobility in everyday heroism. Another great one is Saint Martin of Tours, the 4th century Roman soldier who famously cut his cloak in half to give it to a freezing beggar, leading to his conversion and life as a bishop, blending martial background with charity. All of these saints show that chivalry isn't abstract. Examples throughout history abound. Take Godfrey of Bouillon, the noble from Lorraine who led the First Crusade in 1099. He was a warrior through and through, skilled in arms, fearless in sieges. But when Jerusalem fell, he refused the crown, saying, "I will not wear a crown of gold where Christ wore a crown of thorns." Instead, he took the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Godfrey embodied chivalry. He protected pilgrims, he enforced justice, and he lived piously, dying in the year 1100 after establishing the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Church venerated him as a model, brave yet humble, martial yet merciful. Then there's St. Louis IX, King of France from 1226 to 1270, the only canonized French monarch. Louis was the epitome of chivalric kingship. He led 2 crusades, not for conquest, but to defend the faith. At home, he reformed laws to protect the poor. He fed beggars from his own table, and he enforced Catholic orthodoxy while showing mercy. He washed the feet of lepers. He built hospitals. Chroniclers called him the most Christian king, blending royal power with saintly virtue. He once said in his instructions to his son, "Be devout and obedient to our mother, the Church of Rome." King Louis died on crusade, a martyr king, canonized in 1297. His life shows that chivalry wasn't just for knights. It scaled up to rulers, integrating governance with gospel. And Catholic literature brings all of this to life vividly. In the Arthurian legends, which were steeped in medieval Catholicism, think like the quest for the Holy Grail, the Knights of the Round Table pursued ideals like valor and courtesy and loyalty. Galahad, the pure knight, achieves the Grail because of his chastity and faith, symbolizing the Eucharist. Lancelot, flawed by his affair with Guinevere, still fights heroically, but he repents, showing chivalry's redemptive arc. And all of these tales, from Malory's The Death of Arthur, weren't secular. They wove in monasteries and pilgrimages and Marian themes. The code for these knights in the Arthurian legends was this: thou shalt believe all that the church teaches, thou shalt defend the church, and thou shalt respect all weaknesses. The greatest Catholic author of all time, Dante Alighieri, takes it even further in his Divine Comedy, that 14th century epic of hell and purgatory and heaven. In it, Dante nods to Arthurian romance. There's 2 characters that you encounter in Inferno, Paolo and Francesca, and they're damned for their lust after reading about Lancelot's affair. That's a cautionary tale from Dante against unchaste chivalry. But positively, Dante elevates knightly virtue. So he has Emperor Trajan in Paradise, who was a just ruler who delays battle for a widow's justice, who mirrors chivalric mercy. And he has figures like Saint Bernard guide Dante to Mary, underscoring how true chivalry leads to divine union. Dante's Divine Comedy integrates everything: politics, theology, heroism, showing chivalry as part of the Catholic cosmos. And this whole vision really reflects the Church's holistic worldview. Chivalry wasn't compartmentalized. It sanctified the secular. It turned warriors into witnesses. It built communities, defending monasteries and escorting pilgrims, and it elevated society toward heaven. In a violent, fragmented world, it offered a vision of unity: body and soul, faith and action, man and God. So, why have we turned aside from this in modern Christianity? It's not just a cultural drift, it's a deliberate shift away from that integrated ideal. For example, start with the Reformation. It emphasized personal faith, which is good, but it often de-ritualized and individualized it, stripping away communal disciplines like chivalric vows. And then the Enlightenment prized reason over heroism, turning knights into relics. And then the emergence of large, standing armies in the 16th and 17th centuries played a big role in eroding chivalry. As nations built professional, state-funded forces, war became more centralized and industrialized, with mass conscription and artillery dominating. Individual knights mattered less. Heroism was diluted in vast formations where personal valor took a back seat to strategy and numbers and artillery and logistics. By the Napoleonic era and into the World Wars, the opportunity for that lone chivalric act to defend the weak with a sword in hand faded, replaced by impersonal machinery of conflict. After the 2 world wars came the nuclear age and the Cold War, and pacifism became the ideal. And it rightly critiqued senseless violence. But sometimes, in some ways, we threw out manly virtue with the bathwater. And today, especially in Western Christianity, we've seen a loss of that robust manly spirituality in favor of emotive expressions. Worship services that are heavy on feelings, tears and hugs and emotional highs, while downplaying disciplined fortitude. Contemporary American evangelicalism, where I came from, often portrays Jesus as a gentle therapist, not the resolute king who flipped tables. Now, a lot of people criticize this effeminate Christianity, this Jesus is my boyfriend Christianity, where virtues like courage and self-sacrifice get softened into vague niceness. And the Catholic Church itself, post-Vatican II, in some corners, began to really emphasize dialogue over defense of our values, leading to a catechesis that's more about warm fuzzies than the kind of steel-spined faith that built the Catholic world. Interestingly, many Protestants and evangelicals today are longing for these kinds of manly virtues. There's a real recognition out there that we must recapture some kind of godly masculinity that's not only willing to serve, but also to fight for what is right. There's lots of speakers and books and conferences and YouTubes and podcasts and social media accounts all talking about this hunger for a faith that's inherently masculine, that emphasizes authority and protection and sacrificial leadership. A lot of people are starting to see chivalry or something like it as a model for biblical manhood, drawing on knightly imagery to inspire men to be warriors for the kingdom. We need these models because without them, guys are left adrift in a culture that either demonizes their masculinity as toxic or dilutes it and strips it away, telling them that they ought to embrace their feminine side. Now, what I'm about to say next might seem completely out of place or even grossly inappropriate for a Catholic apologetics podcast. Like I said, I'll probably lose some people over this, but stick with me. The original ideals of Superman and Batman, I'm not talking about all the lame ways that they've been rendered in movies and TV and such sense, but the original ideals were reminiscent of the ideals of chivalry. Think about it. Both Superman and Batman were strong, powerful men with martial skills. Both of them dedicated themselves to using their strength and their fighting skills to defend the weak that were being preyed on by criminals and barbarians. And neither took any reward for themselves. They never took $1 or asked for credit or praise, and they spent their own money and resources to help the helpless. In fact, they hid their identities, changing in phone booths or bat caves. You know, this should be the ideal for men. A man should give himself to protect and serve women and children from criminals and crazies and barbarians. My wife and I have this standing joke between us. Sometimes I'll say, honey, I'd never want to be anything other than who I am, married to you, unless I could be the Batman. Because if I could be the Batman, I think I should be the Batman. And then she'll say to me, honey, if you had the opportunity to be the Batman and you didn't take it, I'd lose respect for you. If you could, you should. You know, I remember when our son was like 4 years old, we had this video game that he and I used to play on the computer in my office. And in this game, there were these pig monsters that were invading a town. And in the game, you had to fight them off and defend the townspeople. And so my wife would come into our office and see my son sitting on my lap playing the game. And she'd say, what are you guys doing? And my son would say, we're shooting the pig monsters. And she'd be shocked. But I'd say, look, if our town gets invaded by pig monsters, don't you want to raise the kind of son who would take up arms to defend the women and children? And she'd say, you have a point. See, back to C.S. Lewis. In his Chronicles of Narnia, he inspired generations of children, particularly young boys, including me, to imagine courageously fighting for what is true and good and beautiful. And in 1952, he wrote an essay called On 3 Ways of Writing for Children, which is something I think he demonstrated some expertise in. And in this essay, he wrote, quote, since it is so likely that children will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Otherwise, you are making their destiny not brighter, but darker. I think that one of the reasons our society is such a hot mess today is that men have lost the ideals, the values, the duties of chivalry. You can say what you want about the aristocratic robber barons of the early 20th century, but when the Titanic hit that iceberg in 1912, about 74% of the women survived compared to only 20% of the men. 52% of the children survived. That night, as the boat was sinking, they largely followed the principle of women and children first into the lifeboats. Now think about it. Many of the richest and most powerful men in the world, like John Jacob Astor and Benjamin Guggenheim, voluntarily gave up their places in the lifeboats to women and children from all classes, including the poor, and they went down with the ship, choosing honor and sacrifice over self-preservation. Do you think that would happen today? Can you imagine that happening today? And if not, are we better off that we've lost those masculine ideals of chivalry and duty and self-sacrifice? Are we better off that so few males today would be the Batman if they could, much less give up their place in a lifeboat to a poor woman and child? And I think it's tragic that over the last 50 years or so, these chivalric ideals have been bred out or crushed out of our boys, and that they have so few channels to cultivate or utilize them. As they grow into men, where are they to channel their masculine energy? Where will they not be criticized or called toxic? And so they waste their masculine energy on video games and sports fandom and fantasy football teams and golf and hobbies. Where are our men and boys allowed to practice the values of chivalry without being vilified? And this shift, I think, has led to a sort of frustrated, depressed, impotent masculinity in our society. Stats show rising male depression, disengagement, guys checking out of church because it feels emasculating. We've traded the imitation of Christ's manly resolve for expressive individualism. Feminism with its valid push for equality, and in the next episode, I'm going to talk about the feminine genius in Catholicism. But modern feminism, secular feminism, sometimes rejects honorable distinctions. It leaves men without any kind of heroic script, any sort of a heroic opportunity in their lives. But Catholicism offers a way back. Think about St. John Paul II's theology of the body, which honors masculine strength and service, or modern groups like the Knights of Columbus, which channels chivalry into charity. Reclaiming chivalry doesn't mean nostalgia or toxicity. It's about living it now. So, if you're a man or a boy, be the knight who defends life in a culture of death, who honors women amid objectification, and who gives self in a selfless age. And if you're a woman, raise your sons that way, because that's a compelling vision. Chivalry as Catholic discipleship, timeless and urgent. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with another episode soon. But before you go, can I quickly ask you to do 5 things? First, please rate the podcast on whatever platform you listen on. That really moves it up in search rankings. Second, please write a review on either Apple Podcasts or on our website, consideringcatholicism.com. That encourages others who are searching for a Catholic podcast to try this one out. Third, please share it with others. Send them a link or post an episode on your social media. Fourth, please write me at consideringcatholicism.com or leave a comment on our website. I'd love to hear your comments, your questions, and your stories. And finally, this podcast is 100% donor supported. My donors keep me going, they help cover my costs, and they let me dedicate more time to researching, writing, recording, and editing to get the episodes out to you faster. So please consider giving a one-time or recurring donation through the links in the show notes or on the website so that this ministry can continue and grow. And never forget, Christus vincit, Christus regnat, and Christus imperat.